Welcome back. We're now going into the calculation process for project complexity. Let's get started. We'll start with breaking down the risk factors for applicable elements and attributes as per the outcome of Section 3, followed by the assignment of weightings and ending off with the actual calculation. But first, a recap of the theoretical framework with applicable elements and attributes as discussed in Section 3. A recap of the applicable elements and attributes across the project execution process as well. Right, let's get into it. We start with organizational complexity. We've defined the risk factors for the attributes of capital expenditure as detailed. You can scale up or scale down the project budget bounds appropriately according to the context of your organization. For example, for an NGO with a 50 million overall annual budget, these figures will need to be adjusted accordingly to be more appropriate for that context. For example, a 20 million project would account for 40% of the annual budget in that context, so the risk factor would be more appropriately assigned high risk. Next, we deal with resources and assign risk factors accordingly. There are key areas that the organization chooses to strategically focus on for a given long-term period. In a well-integrated organization, these then feed into the required talent pipeline with a strategy around how that pipeline is going to be filled. Part of this strategy might include a training plan to upskill current teams with transferable or renewable skills. Another part of the strategy might be to source resources externally that have the advanced skills and experience in those key areas. If this process has already begun, then the upskilling or sourcing process would typically be at an advanced stage by the time those resources are required for a project. In that case, it is logical for the availability of resources to be assigned a low or moderate risk rating, depending on how far the upskilling or sourcing process is from completion. In many organizations, that is not the case, however, and there's usually a rush to source external contractors in the process of project commencement. The risk here is high because you don't know if the vendor supplying the resource is telling the truth about the competence of the resource. Some people just look good on paper. Another approach may be to source a partner claiming to have the capability to deliver a crucial part of the project. The risk here is high because the organization has no control on which resources the partner chooses to put on the project. There are known instances of social workers with no technical or media training, knowledge, or experience being positioned as video platform specialists. It is not uncommon to encounter individuals with highly questionable ethics in these types of contexts. Some technical expertise are required here because the risk factor analysis is a bit oversimplified. Dependencies between two large systems requiring significant integration carry far higher risk than dependencies between 3 to 5 medium systems, where the only requirement is copying a small portion of data from one point to the other. Think B2B systems with data for at most 50 clients versus B2C systems with billions of data entries across a large number of tables. We move on to technical complexity. So we split the risk ratings for goals between goals with a predominantly operational mandate and goals with a predominantly strategic mandate. We recognize that sometimes a project can have both. The approach here is to look at the primary mandate and classify a goal according to that. We've taken the position that revenue-generating goals are typically harder to attain. However, as we said before, it all depends on the context. For example, there's greater risk if the goal for an NGO project is to get 20% of the teenagers in Centurion to abstain from sex until the age of 21 than there is on a project with a goal to increase charitable contributions by 15%. In terms of scope, we look at the number of high-level elements and sub-elements. A well-defined scope has a small number of elements and sub-elements, regardless of how large the project is. A long list of scope elements only adds to the complexity. For example, picture a project to upgrade the billing system of a company. If the element of location contains multiple countries in one phase, and those countries have varying attributes such as business rules and customer policies, over and above the simple ones such as currency and prices, then the project becomes more complex, but not necessarily larger. From a technical perspective, it's as easy as creating multiple instances of the same upgrade with different attributes. But from a project perspective, analyzing and capturing those attributes correctly and getting all the stakeholders on the same page about all the changes will definitely add significant complexity to the delivery of the project. Tech implementation in itself tends to be a roll of a dice, especially when dealing with partners. It's not uncommon for potential partners to hype up capability they don't even understand just to complete the deal and immediately start preparing for litigation in case things go south. There are many anecdotes out there that many have either witnessed or heard of. So when dealing with new tech, it's intuitive that the level of risk starts to rise. Even more so when there's no in-house capability. You are at the mercy of your partner's narrative. There are many anecdotes here of projects dragging on for years with large partner teams seemingly working hard but delivering nothing. Side note, the best approach in this instance is to cut your losses and move on. Because as time goes on with no value, the lies and the losses become bigger. What's left is destroyed shareholder value and an embarrassed executive. We move on to environmental complexity. The bigger the number of influential stakeholders on a project, the more complex it becomes. No rocket science here. We have taken the position that there is no moderate risk in terms of the number of stakeholders. You either have a manageable group or you're growing gray hairs. No middle ground here. So after considering the number of stakeholders, you now have to consider how easy or difficult it would be to get them on the same page. The risk of having a large group of stakeholders can be somewhat minimized if those stakeholders largely hold a similar view on critical issues. Similarly, only two influential senior stakeholders with polar opposite views on everything greatly increases the complexity and risk of failure. In the same manner, enthusiastic internal support from the onset is much more preferable than support that rises and dwindles depending on how key stakeholders view the project in terms of how it's likely to enhance or weaken their position in the organization. A project that has a high priority today and low priority tomorrow from a stakeholder perspective has a high risk of failure. A technology landscape that can go unstable from the sneeze of a fly is a risk to any project when the landscape has to be modified or augmented in some way, even if the new augmentation being introduced is tried and tested. Similarly, a new technology that is barely mature being introduced to a stable landscape will also carry its own complexity with a high risk of failure.